Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ann Bell. She is the Director of Conservation and Education at Ontario Nature. Ann?
Thanks, Julie. Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to this conversation. It's wonderful to see, I can see so many familiar faces, lots of people I don't know too, but anyway, it's nice to be able to see everybody joining in. I have the pleasure this morning of introducing Wesley Johnson, who is going to be answering all the various questions that we bring forward about IPCAs. I think that many of you have probably already met Wesley. I know that during the short time that I've known him, I've really been very impressed by his very sincere and deep commitment to advancing Indigenous protected and conserved areas. He is really in this from his heart, and I really appreciate that. Wesley is the manager of the Indigenous Conservation Leadership and Engagement Policies and Partnerships team, so that's quite a long one, at the Canadian Wildlife Service of Environment and Climate Change Canada. He co-chairs the IPCA working group with Curtis Skur from the Assembly of First Nations. He also co-leads the federal table on IPCAs. He supports the Nature Fund and other IPCAs, and he's a collaborator with the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that, but it's a federal partnership with dozens of different organizations, and he's collaborating with that group as well. He advises on many other domestic and international conservation-related initiatives in strategic partnerships, outreach and communications, and Indigenous knowledge engagement and leadership in conservation. So we're very fortunate to have him on the call today to answer some of the questions that all of us have. I wanted to explain that for the questions today, we're going to begin with one that comes actually from me, because I wanted to make sure that everybody understood Wesley's role at Environment Climate Change Canada. And then though, we reached out to, I think, pretty much everybody on the call to ask whether you had any questions to bring forward today for the session. And we fortunately received lots of good response. So once Wesley's answered my first question, then we are going to switch to the other questions that people brought forward. And we'll take up to an hour to address those other questions. And then around 11 o'clock, we will open the floor up to any other questions that people have thought of during the conversation, you know, things that have come up from other comments. And we'll save that last half hour for a more open session afterwards. Okay, so Wesley, and we're going to try to show the questions up on the screen, and then so that you see them, you hear them, and then you see them as well. So the first question, Wesley, before I jump into this, did you just want to say hello?
For sure. Can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Thank you for your very kind words, and thank you everybody for their time, and certainly reiterate all the thoughts from the introduction, and great to hear your voice, Marilyn. Yeah, no, I'm very excited to be here. I think a lot of the first question in particular will, as you've noted, set the tone for who I am kind of professionally, if you like. But certainly, as you noted, very passionate about this and all the work related to this, and have been for many decades. So it's always, to me, continues to be surreal to be part of these conversations, the fact that they're happening, and but more than anything, thank you everybody for their time, and I hope to do my best on the hot seat today. So, but no, please go ahead. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Wesley. I hope it's not going to be too much of a hot seat for you, but I know you're ready for it regardless. So the first question, we, the partners, we distributed a list of, well, we haven't yet, but they're coming. We are going to be distributing a list of Environment and Climate Change Canada staff contacts to everybody on the call and their roles. to participate at Environment Climate Change Canada.
Mm.
Could you please describe in a little more detail the work that you do, Wesley, to support Indigenous leadership in conservation?
Yeah, question that I should be able to answer very well, you would think, but I find it, because of the evolving nature of this work, I always find it difficult to answer, but I'll do my best. Most of my work, as you know, as many on the phone know or on video know, has been in support of Indigenous leadership and conservation in many ways. And of course, a lot of that work as of late has to do with IPCAs, or Indigenous Protected Conserved Areas, in particular related to, certainly since the last 3 or 4 years, in support of the spaces where that's been going on a lot, or at least the majority of the spaces that probably a lot of us are familiar with. And that is, of course, the pathway to Target 1, where, you know, over the last number of years, there's been a lot of, as we all know, and we'll get into the detail, a lot of investment, a lot of interest, a lot of leadership from Indigenous peoples across Canada around, as I would academically say, around the re-narrativizing conservation in Canada. And so as a result of that, certainly since joining CWS, the majority of my work has been in support of that. And I think along that journey for me, I've met many of you here today in that effort. But as noted at the beginning, that of course has been evolving over the last couple of years as a result of things like the pathway and the Nature Fund and all the other things I'm sure we'll get into later. But as a result of the work now moving from what for the last, if you like, 2-3 years in this space of ideas, in this space of articulation, outreach, engagement, all that type of work, along with things that have evolved in kind of the government policy spaces of creating funding and programs and things like that. A lot of the work has moved from, you know, whether it's hosting, you know, webinars or engagements or outreach or whatever that might be, meetings, gatherings, things like that, has now moved in many ways. Implementation is not a good, I don't like the word, but it's a word that I'm stuck with in the English language, but really from this place of ideas into this place of action. And as a result of that, my role has evolved a lot, where once I was seen as kind of, if you like, the face of the Nature Fund, and through outreach and engagement during like things like the Challenge Fund and the Quick Start and what have you. As a result of the work now becoming, you know, on the lands, it's really in support of that work. So most of my work, although building on all of that and really reflecting all of that, and of course going on during all that time, has really evolved into now even more so helping to create and sustain the conditions for success and of course resilience of aspects of IPCAs, and of course more broadly Indigenous leadership and conservation. So in those places that you mentioned, whether it's at the IPCA working group of the pathway, or the federal table on IPCAs, or all the work that I continue to do in tools development and solutions development, and all the partnership work that's involved with this very horizontal work, it really has just continued to evolve along with that work. So now, as this today is, the work has continued to evolve into supporting partnerships, horizontal partnerships, with Indigenous leadership at the center of supporting, of course, now a very large handful of IPCAs that are evolving in Canada as a result of things like the Challenge Fund or the Guardians Pilot Program, whatever it might be, in support of that. But even more so, as we now begin to federally respond to this in many ways, taking the leadership on that as well. So, I mean, I'll get more into some of the details of that, but all that to be said, my role has really evolved along with the overall movement. So as a result, versus kind of doing things directly related to the projects. It's really working in the partnership spaces and building on those partnerships that were developed over the last number of years, and continuing to hopefully do my part in sustaining the space for success and resilience in all the things that you're doing as partners and as good allies. Hopefully that answered the question without too many words.
That's great, Wes. Thanks so much. I'm Rachel Plotkin from the David Suzuki Foundation. And as Anne said, our next step is going to be asking Wes some of the questions that were emailed into us, and we will endeavor to get through them all. If we're not able to, we will follow up on email, and then we will respond to everyone who is on our email list. If you're joining this webinar and you're not part of our list, then it would be a good idea to send your email address to Jackie through the chat system if you want to be included in the follow-up from this event. So I'm going to be reading some of the next questions, and then as Anne mentioned, at 11 o'clock, we will switch over and use the raise hand function for any reflections on things that Wes has said or people who weren't able to ask their questions ahead of time. So the first question is, what are the key steps towards IPCA establishment, securement, and designation? If there are no key steps and Canada asserts IPCAs are established on a case-by-case basis, absent this kind of guidance, from the IPCAs that have been established, what were the common features that led to their establishment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it really speaks to, in many ways, the articulation of what IPCA means, in my view. And whereas in my experience, from those that I've talked to over the last number of years, the perception or the feelings or the intention of an IPCA really sets in motion what those steps might look like. And when using words like establishment, securement, designation really moves into that very jurisdictional place. And so that is of a particular area within the context of IPCAs. And what I mean by that is there are IPCAs can be designated or claimed to be IPCAs as from a community and of course in support with allies if needed to claim that it's an IPCA. And it's really a self-declaration or a self-determinant act. And I'm sure those that know Eli have heard him talk at length in this context. And then there's that, I see it as that second or another space, which is that countable space of whether an IPCA, if it's contemplating protection and conservation in this somewhat, if you like, internationally classified space where there's CBD classifications towards what a protected area and or ECM, whatever that might be. That's a countable towards targets space, if you like, recognition internationally in that space. There's different processes to that, and there's a different mindset for that. But when you get into this place of really where these words are home, establishment, securement, and designation, that's really the jurisdictional space of IPCAs, and that in many ways is framed by counted towards targets or appropriately recognized of IPCAs. And there are existing regulations, legislations, processes in place for the types of IPCAs that might be very similar to what a federally protected area or provincial or territorial protected area, because those two could be IPCAs. But it's when you get into the spaces of rights recognition, title recognition, all that, that's where the tension starts, and that's where these words tend to take on a new life. And so it's not to say that there aren't existing processes or steps towards some of the types of protection and conservation that have been contemplated and acted upon within Canada in its context. But I think where this questioning comes from, in my view, and again, I'm sure I could be wrong, but in my view, from the conversations I've had in this very space, what we're really talking about is appropriate recognition of IPCAs, recognizing that traditionally within Canada, co-management, co-governance of protected areas with Indigenous peoples is, although taken on in some ways in some more latter versions of federally and protected, provincial and territorial or protected areas. Now I'm thinking of in the north where it's quite often the case, if not always, but it's really in this new space of recognition of rights and responsibilities in protected and conserved areas. So I think there's certainly, and I think, you know, in the places like the National Steering Committee of the Pathway, where most of the jurisdictions in Canada sit, and of course, grapple and struggle with all the things related to protected conserved areas and the relationships therein. This is one of the spaces, particularly IPCAs, hence why we have a working group under the National Steering Committee that I co-chair with Curtis. This is one of the spaces that, what actually within the ICE report, one of the major moose in the room, the jurisdictional moose, I always say the smelliest moose, this is one of the most important conversations going on, and that is to say that there are gaps within existing regulatory legislative regime to establish very clear and distinct steps towards some of the spaces that, in the context of IPCAs, that have not been explored significantly in Canada's context. So, so as a result of that, there are some jurisdictions out there, and I'm thinking now of Northwest Territories, Nova Scotia, and increasingly some of the Prairie provinces in BC that are seriously considering these steps. And of course, a lot of these steps are provincial and territorial. In the context of the federal processes, this is exactly part of the, as I mentioned before, the federal response that's now going on, is thinking this through, because this is exactly that. Well, this is the moose in the room. This is, as I said, the stinkiest moose in the room, and so this is definitely one of the spaces that we're thinking a lot about, and with our partners as well in places like the National Steering Committee, the IPCA Working Group, the CRP, and these other places, because it's something that needs to be thought through collaboratively as well, or it would be clearly counterintuitive. So there are some existing guidance, and it's one of the things that we're pulling together in the context of the solutions bundle, which I won't get too much into today, maybe in the letter and question, but to clearly provide guidance on the steps to the establishment of a protected area from the experiences to date. And of course, that process will identify gaps, not only for that space, but also in places like decision support tool processes of identifying, like I said, the differences between being countable and counted towards things like targets. So hopefully that helps.
That's great, Wes. Thank you. We will move on to the third question, which is, what does the land designation become after the IPCA process, either federal or provincial? And what are the possibilities for legal protection in land designation? And what is the process for designation?
Yeah, much the same. Very similar question, almost like a subset of the first question. There are existing processes recognizing that most of this is going on in Northwest Territories, but very often the process of designation is in some cases seen as an incremental process. And that is to say that there's recognition of Indigenous legal protection. And of course, then there's kind of jurisdictional, provincial and territorial jurisdictional legal protection. And some of those exist within the existing jurisdictional landscape, as I mentioned before, where in other cases there's missing pieces in that landscape. And this is a big thematic stream of the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, or the CRP, as I mentioned. And so this is a significant area of work that's going on right now to not only to be able to articulate and understand and explain the existing landscape for jurisdiction of land designation and protection, but also to identify the gaps in that and the barriers to establishment and appropriate recognition of IPCAs. So that there are existing processes in place that are being kind of brought together to be able to share through the solutions bundle so that people understand the jurisdictional landscape that they're in, because this is not an easy thing. So I'm certainly not going to claim that I understand it all. But all that to be said, that there are people working very hard on this, and so I encourage, as I probably will say a few times along the way, I encourage those that are working on IPCAs now, and those that are contemplating doing it, really pushing for this as part of their work plan, and really pushing their partners to articulate this and to work through the partnerships, both that I've identified and others within our networks that we can certainly, carry on connecting on into the, long after this call, to make sure that this work is done. And obviously complicated with some of the things that we're collectively living through right now. But there are existing legislation and existing landscape that needs to be understood. And as I said, there's lots of work being done in identifying the gaps and the barriers to doing this work.
Thanks, Wes. And in
Yep.
fact, the fourth question is also very much in a similar theme. And maybe I will take a little bit of liberty and put a fine point on it. The question is Canada working with the provinces and territories on legislation, including legislative amendments that would provide for IPCAs? And would this kind of work, would this be the kind of work contemplated in the Pathways group? Maybe I'll ask, since you just spoke to the kind of general processes happening between the federal government and provinces, if there's any chance that you can focus specifically on Ontario, because this is an Ontario webinar for Ontario nations.
In the process, kind of, I'm not going to say early stage processes, but during the process of the challenge, this is an issue that came up a lot and certainly came out of the ICE report as recommendation. So as I said, it's been on the radar for a long time. And I suspect that there was probably, as there was in a lot of other contexts, a lot of outreach between jurisdictions, and I'm thinking now federally to province of Ontario, to try to figure out what is the space that's out there for IPCAs. But it's definitely being very much contemplated and worked on in the context of the pathway. So I'm not aware of any, but I can certainly reach out to folks to find out what is going on out there. And I think one of your contacts is the regional office of CWS as well. And this would be one of the things that would definitely be the stuff that they be working on, because it's at the heart of all of this work. And as you've seen, 3 questions in a row asking about it. So clearly a priority for partners, clearly being identified as something that we need to work on. As I said, it's one of the key moose in the room. So it's definitely a priority. Can certainly work with them to make sense of it and to see if there's opportunities therein. But certainly that's something I can take back and find out if there's anything live going on, because this is very much a live question.
That'd be great. And do you know of any potential legislative amendments that are on the books?
You mean in Ontario?
No, more broadly. I didn't want to.
No, it's fine. No, just making sure. Didn't want to get off the point. For sure, Northwest Territories did a huge amendment, recognizing, of course, that it's unique because of modern treaty and devolution and what have you. Has done a lot of work in this area. So it kind of points to opportunities as well at the same time, when I think this is somewhat at the heart of the question, is that if other provinces and territories are doing it, why can't we learn from one another? Why can't we share our experiences? Why can't we follow suit and do similarly? And that is at the heart of why the pathway exists, is really to create a common space for sharing on a number of different things. And this is definitely one of those things. And so we're in the process of doing a huge knowledge gathering process from across the provinces and territories to figure out part of the response, of course, is legislative response and being a priority of that response. So I would imagine that there's lots to be able to share on that, and certainly there's lots of information in places like the Solutions Bundle around legislative landscape, and that of course is being expanded right now as a result of the work of the CRP and the IPCA working group and all the work that's going on with the challenge. So I think that in the coming weeks and months, we're going to see a lot more information on this and a lot more sense of where we are at. And for those, like particularly academically, a lot more work being focused on trying to make sense of that legislative landscape and identify the barriers and the challenges and roadblocks to moving forward with IPCAs.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Question 5 is, in what circumstances will Canada allocate funding to buy out third-party interests? An example is the Jumbo Ski Resort, and support First Nations management on lands which can be designated as IPCAs.
Yeah, much the same, unfortunately. I guess this is the story of Canada in a way. A lot of this has to do with whether the allocation of funds is amenable within that jurisdictional landscape. And as you've noted, that example is a big one. And it took a lot of work to get there and a lot of advocacy. And so much like anything else within Canada's landscape, particularly when it comes to land management, there's always the tension between federal lands, provincial territorial lands, crown lands versus private lands. And this is really, this is the complex thing around land management in Canada. And so not to say that it is case by case all the time, but to a very big extent it is. And also as a result of the competing interests. But again, much like everything else in Canada when it comes to land management, it's always in part of the landscape of whether it's amenable to the people that already own the land, or if it's crown land, or if it's provincial or federal lands. And so there are circumstances, and to a certain extent, this is also part of that, if you like, roadmap to an IPCA is understanding that the kind of the landscape, if you like, or the conditions for those lands. And it's complex because some provinces, as an example, have different rules for land trusts, and it's really complex. So the idea of understanding that landscape and the circumstances, the conditions for, in this case, success for allocating funds to buy out interests, which, as we all know, is often a process for this type of work. It really is a process of relationship building, jurisdictional realities, and really the competing interests, and a lot of hard work and advocacy. So it's the circumstances, although can be similar, is really very much very, very case by case, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. But I think, again, this is part of that landscape piece, this jurisdictional landscape piece, again, really. And as I said, learning from examples, this is a fairly, although a long-standing, but certainly a recent decision, is going to be seen and looked at quite strongly in the coming months to make sense of the opportunities that already exist in the context of challenge, and of course any future processes around re-envisioning land management in Canada.
Thank you. For number 6, you can either speak to it, or if you have something that you could send around that we could distribute to the participants, that would be fine too. But the question is, where are the IPCA technical experts within government?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess IPCA specifically as a subject, in the sense of how it's articulated in the Indigenous Circle of Experts report, recognizing that we just passed our 2nd year anniversary of the bundling of that report with the National Advisory Panel's report, is, in the context of the government, is a relatively new thing. And so, although 2 years ago, if I said IPCAs within the federal government, recognizing that, I don't know everyone in the federal government, particularly in the regions, as I went across Canada, coast to coast to coast over the last year to the different regions, I had a lot of questions about the acronym IPCA. And luckily, as a result of the hard work, probably more than me, certainly, Indigenous leadership in Canada, for those that were involved in ICE and others involved in that work by extension. There's a lot more awareness around IPCAs, and certainly it's gone beyond just kind of the socializing the concept of IPCA. But this is definitely a place where there's a lot of work to do. In the regions, as you know, there are regional offices, and on that list of contacts, you'll have the CWS Regional Office for Ontario contact there on IPCAs. So in all the regions, there's been someone identified to not only learn about IPCAs, but also to support IPCAs, not only in the context of the challenge, but also just more generally for questions and for those that are partnerships that are contemplating and doing it forward as a bit of a starting point, if you like, within CWS. But you heard mentioned in my introduction this notion of a federal table on IPCAs, which again is that part of that federal response to IPCAs. It's being contemplated right now that not only within the usual places that have been managing protected areas like Parks Canada, ECCC, particularly CWS, where I work, and other folks that we work quite avidly with in existing protected areas. Certainly IPCAs as a concept and they're growing in technical expertise around that. But there's a lot of work to do on this, and this is part of the reason why I've been pushing so strongly internally to establish an IPCA working group, because we have a lot of work to do. And I envision, and again, this is about I guess a dream for Wesley more than anything else, and it's something I'm certainly pushing hard for, is to build training for IPCAs, and certainly advocating for existing training and taking the existing training. I'm just thinking of some of the training, the ICE report training, the IPCA Foundation, things like that. That's increasingly being taken up by officials, but we're going to be advocating quite strongly in the coming years. And I think the Challenge Fund and all the projects therein will create this space and create the need, and really create the ability for me to be able to push, and others to push very hard to really raise the expertise and the knowledge base around IPCAs and all the things related to that within the federal system. And so I'm quite excited about the fact that the projects are going, obviously for many reasons, notwithstanding, of course, the opportunities for Indigenous leadership and conservation, but really hooking on that, the need for us to get so much better on this, to go way, way past what an IPCA means as an acronym, and see it as part of our responsibilities in reconciliation, our responsibilities for UN DRIP, our responsibilities for a lot of things that we're being asked to be as public servants, and hopefully really see that as a requirement for doing this type of work. But I would argue that how we're doing this work in the context of IPCAs is translatable to any work. So yes, focusing on IPCA technical expertise, but really seeing how to do this work is something we should be doing in all places.
Great, thanks. The seventh question is, are there other IPCA success stories in other parts of Canada that are farther ahead that communities could reach out to?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there's already places that we're familiar with that have identified IPCA success stories, and in places like the ICE report and other things that even the gatherings have pulled together. And I even saw some of that when I was in Kingston, where folks were connecting with one another, certainly wanting to do it more and hoping to be able to have the opportunity to know the list of those that were taking this work on. And I think we're in that space now that the contribution agreements have, as far as I know, have all been signed. Again, that's not the area I work in, but my understanding is that they've all been signed. So it creates that space for sharing more. And I think we'll see that a lot more in the coming months. But certainly it's at the heart of most of what I do, is in capacity building, outreach, connecting dots, connecting people, that there'll be lots of opportunities to be able to get this information. And I can certainly share, and I can, as I said, I can reach back to the program as well to be able to share what I can share. But as I say, I think what's going to be able to be shared is going to go exponential in the coming months as a result of the contribution agreements being signed. But also another project that I'm working on, a documentary project, which is really a continuation of an existing project, but really moving into this implementation phase like everything else for me, will also be an opportunity to share those success stories. So I think, you know, capacity building, knowledge sharing, mobilization, all these things really revolve around success stories and challenges and all these other things that are part of the day-to-day and the spirit of IPCA. So this is where I spend most of my work, and I can certainly hopefully stay connected with everybody on the phone and all those that couldn't join to be able to do that, because that's just critical. There's no doubt about that.
Great, thank you. And I'll just mention that both Ontario Nature and the David Suzuki Foundation have some reports on our website that share conversations of Indigenous conservation practitioners that folks could turn to if they were interested. In question 8 is, could ECC provide contact information for other First Nations working on IPCAs in Ontario?
Yes, well, I guess it's a very similar question, where it wasn't too long ago, and I remember having this conversation with a few folks in Kingston, where they really wanted to reach out to whether they were neighbors or whether they were, you know, people that they didn't know about, to be able to share and to learn and to and raise and lift each other up. And it's part of this capacity and sharing and learning and success stories and all that. It's really all part of that. And absolutely, I'm going to reach, as I mentioned just recently now, I'll reach out to the program, because it was really day to day with the contribution agreements until they are signed. It created this kind of a bit of a vacuum to share contact information, but I can certainly raise this question, and I'm sure we're getting, if we're not already there, I'm sure we're going to get there very shortly, notwithstanding kind of the conditions that we're in, to be able to provide kind of information for communities and their allies to connect with each other as well.
That's great to hear.
Yep.
The next question is, how do communities get in touch with the province of Ontario, and how do we get help to engage Ontario, or even just to make contact?
Yep.
And further, what is the role of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks with respect to IPCAs?
Yeah, two big questions, and mentioned in connecting dots back to what I said earlier, really where we're going now, in the sense of these things are becoming on the land, and these are really important questions. I really encourage, particularly in that first question, how to connect with the province, how best to connect with the province, because it's also related to the second question, and how to engage with Ontario and advice on that. Some of that, of course, will come from allies like yourselves and other allies that have done work with the province of Ontario and other provinces, because there is some similarity on how to proceed, if you like. But I really highly encourage, this is a question for the regional office, and you'll have the contact, if not later today, certainly in short order, because that is definitely one of the questions that I'm sure Elizabeth has a lot of experience with, not only in the context of IPCAs, in the context of a lot of things. So I highly encourage, if it may not be Elizabeth that answers the question, but she's really your line into kind of the partnerships and the kind of the how to, you know, work within the system. Definitely somebody to reach out for that. But for the second question, it's an interesting question, because it really speaks to one of the things that I've noticed in my experience. And again, I say this because I didn't have a lot of experience. I have never worked in the province or in a territory, and I didn't study that scale too much beyond some of the early Lands for Life projects. That, you know, different ministries, and again, I'm not going to say that the ministry, although they're really compilation of people, I recognize, but different ministries have different opinions on different priorities when it comes to land management. And some of that is mandate driven, some of that is kind of tradition, if you like. where some of this is naturally, as when you involve humans, also personal. And but the intricacies of the different roles is certainly not something I know about in Ontario. I suspect there's allies out there that probably make it a point of understanding the nuances of the different roles. Apologize, that's not one of my kind of areas of expertise, but I'm sure Elizabeth would be able to answer some of that. But I highly encourage anyone that works with allies in Ontario to push your allies to figure this out as well, because that is, I mean, this is not, in this case, not just about IPCAs, it's about a number of things, although probably very nuanced for IPCAs as a result of mandates. But I highly encourage people to reach out to Elizabeth on this and really push our allies. And I'm thinking NGOs and foundations, not to throw, I'm not trying to throw you under the bus,
No.
but really to try to wait and understand that the complexities of the different roles in there and their mandates.
Thank you. And I will say that that is one of the ways that I think our groups can be allies, is to put pressure on government where government is being recalcitrant. The next question is, assuming the federal budget is delayed for at least another month or two, if there is funding in the budget for the Nature Fund, when could we expect another call for applications? And further, if there is no funding for the Nature Fund in the 2020 federal budget, is it correct that there will not be another round of applications for the Nature Fund?
Yeah, it's a question that that we would all love to be able to answer, and we all expected to be able to answer by now, obviously, but because usually the budget is in end of February, early March. Clearly, as we all know, we're all living to some extent the impacts of what's going on right now. This has become very complicated for a number of different reasons. One, in my view, and again, this is more, you know, kind of where I guess my brain tends to go in this kind of strategic place, is, you know, there's, notwithstanding my view that conservation should be a significant response to COVID, things like COVID-19. And again, we could talk at length on that, I'm sure. But there's going to be a lot of competing interests for the budget. And as a result of that, certainly within my context, I advocate for seeing investment in IPCAs and nature and conservation as really part of our response to this. But again, not everyone sees it that way, and I respect that. But all that to be said, there's going to be a lot of competing interests. So it's hard to say what's going to happen. But the second part of that question is a call for applications. And again, I'm not in the program. I don't decide how things go. I never have decided how things go. Applications just scares me. Hopefully we're considering, but again, I probably going out on a branch a little bit, but hopefully applications isn't the way we go with this moving forward. But we'll leave that one for another day, not to get too antagonistic. But yeah, if there is no funding in the 2020 budget, it's hard to say, because there's been so much effort and interest and investment in this work, and emphasis on interest, and so many allies, and so much, I mean, as we all know, I would suspect that the amount of applications that came in for the Nature Fund, like eclipsed the amount of fund that was available. So clearly there is a lot of interest in IPCAs and other forms of conservation and protection. So it's hard to imagine that there won't be continued investment in this. What that will look like, and again, that's not my area. I'm not in the funding. I mean, I'm only in, I guess I have the opportunity of really just dreaming about this, but there's just so much interest in this. And when you think about 25 by 25 and 30 by 30, I mean, we're in the middle of negotiations internationally for new targets. There's a lot of people out there that do see, similarly to me, that investment in conservation, nature, Indigenous leadership and conservation as should be part of our response. It's hard to imagine not there being investments, notwithstanding obviously competing interests. How that will be rolled out, whether, as I said, applications, how operationally that will be done, I have no idea. That is definitely not something I know anything about, but certainly will come to light in short order. But it is really hard to imagine when I think when you've got you know, the Prime Minister saying that a conservation will be done through Indigenous leadership, knowledge, and engagement, and we want to get to 25 by 25, which I don't know. It's like, just to do the math, it's, you know, it's 4 years after this round of CBD implementation, and we're going to somehow get there without more of it. It's just hard. It's hard to imagine not there being investment. But again, people in the public service, and I think sometimes, I know I didn't understand this before I became a public servant, the public servants have limited influence on the budget. We, of course, are asked for all our great ideas. And of course, my ideas of, you know, the context of IPCAs as a response to both COVID-19 and actually the broader extinction event, as Eli likes to call it, I mean, to say that I advocate strongly would be a grave understatement, through many forms. But we have limited influence over the budget, but I think we're all very hopeful and certainly are designing the work to demonstrate success. And I would say that this is also coupled with other projects and other programs like the Guardians pilot program, community-based monitoring programs, all these other programs that are very similar. We all collectively advocate internally for this to be a priority, but we'll see. We'll see. It's the best, unfortunately, I can say.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Wes. The next question that came in from one of the participants on the call is, how can we stop the destruction of millions of fish happening every year in the Black Sturgeon River east of Thunder Bay? With the Camp 43 Dam on the river blocking migration and people fishing during the spawning, the fish don't have a chance to reproduce.
Yeah, I did a little bit of research on this just when I saw this question, because I'll be honest, I don't know much about it, and I apologize. But at least I know a little bit more now. But I'm going to channel my inner Eli, if I could, and say it's really about strong advocacy and making the issue known through alliedship and partnerships, which is at the heart of IPCAs, and really connecting the dots as whoever authored this has done, and advocating quite strongly within communities, with municipalities, with schools, and really pushing this point. I mean, certainly there can be an IPCA framed around this issue. There's no doubt about that. And I would encourage that as well, to frame these issues. And this is something that certainly came up time and time again, and maybe not this particular example, but time and time again through my outreach and engagement over the last couple of years, to frame, you know, projects around issues such as this. Again, notwithstanding, I didn't get enough chance to kind of dig into, as I said, I'm not a huge jurisdictional, kind of provincial and territorial jurisdictional guy. Obviously, that's going to be changing in the coming months. But certainly there could be a lot of kind of realities to this. There are going to be challenges, but I would recommend, as I do with any partner, that when I hear, because I am told stories like this very often, to frame initiatives and to do a lot of outreach, and to really find alliedship within municipalities, within MP offices, and all the like, because it really, in many ways, is at the heart of what this is all about. So, as for the specific example, it's hard for me to say, but certainly something I would say that I'm sure allies would be really interested in taking on.
Just before we open the floor to questions, I'm going to slide one in, which is, you mentioned that there was triple the interest in receiving funding for Indigenous LED conservation in Canada. What was the follow-up with the 2/3 that were not able to receive the funding that they requested? And have they been receiving capacity and support to move forward with their own initiatives?
Yeah, some of that I know, some of it I don't, and that's really the nature of programs and you know, the hierarchy and big systems like federal government. But I do know, I mean, there were simple, more, I guess, more obvious things like follow up with projects that were submitted in kind of the form of like regret letters and suggestions of where they could go next. But beyond that, I'm not sure. Certainly, it comes up a lot that clearly there's a list of folk out there that are interested in doing this work, and potentially as an option, if there were to be more funding, something to be considered is it, do you reach out to those projects and say, you know, versus doing another round of applications, do you reach out to those folks and say, okay, well, you know, where are you at now? Does it make sense? There's certainly, as you've identified, there was additional investment in capacity projects beyond kind of what was anticipated for the Nature Fund Challenge projects. So that's already happened as well in the context of capacity projects. So beyond the 27 IPCAs, I think there's an additional some like 30 capacity projects that were those early stage projects. But I personally see it, again, I'm not in the program area, so I have little to do with this, but certainly within the context of the CRP, I think what this is alluding to is that clearly there's a number of partnerships out there that are interested in moving forward with this work. Sure, there may be differences and challenges that maybe in this context made it so that it wasn't something that could be supported at the time, but maybe some of that has changed, some of that has evolved, some of the, you know, what is envisioned as a project has changed. I mean, there's so many factors that may have evolved that I think it would be a great resource to continue investments. But again, that's out of my hands, but certainly something that I advocate for internally.
Great, thank you. So we are now going to be opening the floor for questions. If you raise your hand, then I will call on you, and then Jackie can take you off of mute. That's what we felt was the most organized way to proceed. Okay, we have a question from Lynn Palmer.
Yeah, hi Wesley, nice to meet you this way. I'm just curious, with the evolution of IPCAs, you know, in the last few years, could you speak to, does the federal government, or, you know, ECC specifically or overall, have, in terms of authority, is the federal government now officially using the term co-management, or possibly something else, if you could speak to that, given that, you know, in the past, probably less than a decade ago, they officially didn't. It was always collaborative management, even for such cases, you know, as say Guayhanas, probably others, where I know in that case, the HIDA definitely said it's co-management, and that was always an iconic case, still is. Yeah. Just be interested in terms of hearing about that, and does the federal government like still consider that there's final ministerial authority related to IPCAs, or has that evolved?
Yeah, no, great question. And, you know, along with a lot of other things, places like the ICE report introduced language that, you know, whether knowingly or unknowingly has been introduced to the language of the federal government, and co-management, co-governance, you know, within that context of the spectrum of IPCAs is part of that evolution, if you like. I would say I certainly hear co-management a lot. I think it's used increasingly in contexts, at least for me, because of where I work and who I work with, in the context of parks. Parks Canada uses it a lot. And but you're right. There is a nuance to semantic that is often used, and again, not to get too academic, but that's kind of where my background is in this for many decades. And there is a bit of an unpacking to that and a decolonialization to that for sure. And so certainly within the circles that I work in federally, co-management, co-governance are definitely words that are being used. And of course, there's nuances to that. It's not one model for all of that, but certainly what's being contemplated is much more on this, recognition of that spectrum of really going beyond just kind of having people, be involved in the implementation or the delivery of whatever it is you're doing, and really involving partners, particularly Indigenous partners in the context of conservation, in the design and the development of things, which is really where that co-management place begins, at those early stages of ideation. And without that, it really is co-implementation. And so that comes up obviously often in modern treaties, particularly in the North, and it's quite normal. And it's in the South where things get a bit murky in these contexts. But yeah, no, co-management, co-governance, all these words were contextualized in things like the ICE report and the NAP report, and continue to remain in things like the National Steering Committee's One with Nature report. So it's definitely part of the language that I use. But again, like you've noted, there is nuances to that, and not to be taken lightly.
And just so, is in any agreements or actually written documents, is ministerial authority not used, like final minister authority or anything along that lines? That's what I really would like to know. Like, is that gone now? Because that was always there, like, in any protected area in other contexts, right?
Well, that's fettering them. That fettering the authorities, and that's certainly authority from, and again, this is probably more poli-sci than anything, but federal authority or ministerial authority can be delegated, as you know, and those delegations vary from very simple things to very elaborate things, but all of it is always considered in whether it's going to fetter the authority of the minister by doing that. So that's an ongoing dialogue with any ministry and any decision. And but again, those tend to be in the context of existing jurisdictional legislative landscapes, which is at the source of the jurisdictional moose in the room. And so though that has not been resolved, that is definitely something at the source of tension, as it always has been and probably always will be. I'm not in those. I mean, again, there's a difference between politics and bureaucracy, obviously, and I'm in bureaucracy and not politic, and I can't wade in. I certainly don't want to wade into politics, but that's definitely something that remains, and probably a source of a lot of the jurisdictional moose tension. So I'm not entirely up to speed on where that is. That's pretty high level. That's way above my pay grade, as I like to say. But certainly that will have to be something that's being considered in the context of appropriate recognition and in any jurisdictional legislative change, because that's in direct line of ministerial decision making and authorities, and whether they'll be fettered. So that's a live question that I probably should not even try to answer.
Okay, if anyone else has any questions, you can raise your hand or raise your computer hand.
Jody has her hand raised.
Great.
Not sure if this is an appropriate question, and given what you've been talking about, but what I'm curious about is, are you working in partnership with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization and the Indigenous leaders from Eagle Lake and Wabigoon in northwestern Ontario to protect the conservation areas within Eagle Lake and the Wabigoon area. And also, could you tell me then what are your plans to protect that area? So I'm not sure whether that's an appropriate question, but.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, and I hope it's okay that I can't answer some questions. I hope that's appropriate, because I certainly don't have that level of knowledge, but certainly there's the people out there that we can find the answer to that and to find kind of where that's at. I've taken down the name and the nuclear waste as well. Maybe if there's some way for me to connect Dodie with somebody in the regional office, would you be okay with that, to find out the answer to that?
Yes, yeah, that would be fine.
Would that be something that the host could connect us
Certainly,
on?
yeah, certainly.
Okay, all right, thank you.
It looks like we have a question from Tobias. And maybe actually if everyone could introduce themselves, that would be great too. Just, yeah, who you are, where you're from.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Ani bonjour. Mopagizis Disnaka Shawanaga Donjaba Wapshishi Dodam. My name is Tobias Nokwabi. I'm the lands manager for Shawanaga First Nation. I want to send warm wishes and all those good things to everybody on the call today from our members here in Shawanaga. You're in our thoughts, likewise with the rest of Canada. And in case I don't get to speak again, I will thank Elder Marilyn for her kind words that she's going to share with us after this call. Shmikwech. I got a question or two, actually, Wesley, and just a recommendation. My first question is, I understand there was a review process of all the proposals that came in through the Target 1 Challenge by the feds and the province. I'm curious if those reviews were noted or any positives or negatives were recorded, and if we're able to review those. The second part of my question is how will the lands designated by Canada and other provinces under the Target 1 Challenge, so under the 17% that's committed to be protected, how will those lands be designated that aren't that don't have any recognition with the IPCA? And I guess my recommendation for the future would be to make the information for the First Nations, whatever province they're in, available to them sooner for the proper technicians that we need to contact. It's been 1 year already, and we're kind of, we're just kind of getting that information now. So I find that part to be very challenging, and I would recommend for any future IPCAs or any other work like that, that if that information could be shared previously, because to me, that would be the best way to start off a good relationship. Miigwech.
Thanks, Tobias. Great to see you again. We met in Kingston. Happy to see you're doing well. Follow-up for the proposals, as far as I know, is available. So I think, like you said, when one does a proposal, and having done them myself, you want to learn what you did well, and you want to learn what you didn't do well, because you want to, if you're going to do it again, it would be good to know how best to do it. I think that's fair, and that's fair for any process feedback. And I've heard been said many times in the context of, although I'm not in that program, but I've heard it said many times that that's available. So certainly connecting you and again, this would be probably a fairly straightforward question for the regional office of CWS to follow up with you and to provide that level of feedback, what level of feedback you need. So I highly encourage, I mean, I've taken note and I will be following up, but highly encourage that we connect the dots between the regional office and you to make sure you get, and any partner gets the feedback they need to get a sense of why they either did succeed or did not succeed. And even if you did succeed, how you can do better. I mean, I think that's fair. And I think that needs to be made available. And as far as I know, that is available, particularly now the contribution agreements have been signed. So hopefully that helps with that question. The question of counting towards 17%, I'm gonna kind of go back to something I said earlier, and it's an ongoing debate. You know, what is an IPCA? I get asked this question all the time, and it's really at the heart of that question. An IPCA is an IPCA when an Indigenous community or group of communities says it is, period. It's full stop. It's really that simple. That's what the ICE report says. That's my understanding of it, and that's what I've been saying for years. Where it gets complicated is when you get into this world of counting towards targets, and that's never an easy thing. I mean, we'll get over that, the nature of where target counting comes from, and because that's a long conversation. But when it comes to countable towards things like the target of 17%, there are things, calculations, criterion, categorizations, all these things are available to all of us in the context of places like CBD and really where that target comes from, the IUCN. And that's a negotiation process that we're actually already in again for our next targets. So whether it's countable or not, that's pretty straightforward. And there's tools out there that if folks, you know, either here or others not here would like to be a part of, certainly connect with me, because I can make that connection quite easily. So can the regional office, but feel free to reach out to me. But that's really about whether an IPCA or a part of an IPCA, because an IPCA isn't always as a whole a protected area. It can be a compilation of spaces, a land relationship plan, for instance. But if there are pieces of it or as a whole that can be categorized within the context of IUCN categorization, it's countable towards a target. But that's not the same thing as counted towards a target. And what I mean by that is those that are responsible for submitting calculations towards international targets, in this case the IUCN CBD 17%, it's in the hands of the provinces and territories. So they ultimately decide what gets counted, not what's countable, not what's an not what is an IPCA, but what's counted towards the target. So there could be many situations, and we already have situations. I'm thinking travel, you know, travel parks, things like that, that by international standards, they're countable, but they're not counted towards the targets. So that's part of that jurisdictional conundrum. And that is at the heart of a lot of conversations as of late, as a result of the fact that we're in negotiations for our next target, and the fact that places like the Pathway are saying, feds are saying, okay, well, why is there a difference between what's countable and what's counted? But again, we're back to that jurisdictional conversation again. So who has the authority to submit calculable or countable protected and conserved areas towards international targets? In Canada right now, it's provinces and territories and some nonprofits. So it's a complex one that I don't have I have suggestions for, but I don't have the authority to give the answer for. But I can tell you that comes up a lot, and has obviously came up a lot in the ICE report. So that is something that I imagine is going to be at the heart of a lot of conversations. Already are, but will continue to be a lot of conversations around that very point. The difference between countable and counted. Hopefully that.
Thank you. I think we'll take our last question before we turn to closing remarks and the closing prayer from Chris Ross.
Chris, you're ready to go.
Okay, sorry, I was unmuted myself. Good morning. Thank you for your response. I am more in like hands-on kind of response. You responded my question in the last answer you did. So I'm more like how these initiatives like the IPCAs are reconciliating the traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge with management. So even though the government is not accountable for the management, I think is what I understood. Is there any success story about the reconciliation between the science and the technical knowledge that the government brings with the TK and IK from the community that has that area?
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's not only success stories in the present context of IPCAs and things that have evolved over the last a few years, but there are success stories, and that's what makes them success stories in many ways. Is that very bringing together of two-eyed seeing and different knowledge systems and building those into governance models, and that's part of the vision of co-management and co-governance is to really bring together different knowledge systems. So I think there are definitely some past success stories, existing success stories that can be shared, and some present ones that are evolving right now that in many ways IPCAs probably in the majority of cases will be digging into that area and trying to reconcile that very thing. So multiple knowledge systems and resolving that in the context of ethical space and two-eyed seeing is at the heart of IPCAs. So I think there's definitely existing, but I think that's probably going to be one of the primary capacities for all partners that needs to be focused on for capacity building, but also at the heart of a lot of the success stories. And certainly in the context of a project that I'm working on that I recognize I haven't been really talking about, the documentary project, at the heart of the stories that are being told about IPCAs. So I think there's lots out there that can be shared.
And how this is being matched with the climate change situation that we are living now in our communities, especially in the northern communities.
Can you repeat that? I didn't quite hear the beginning of that.
How this all this process of multiple knowledge and multiple management processes are being matched with the climate crisis that we are facing and going to face in the future. Like we are facing now some climate crisis, and how all this is being matched with climate change.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the use of the word matched, but I'll do my best. It's actually becomes paramount as a result, because not only is science, notwithstanding the propensity for people to kind of wait for science to kind of validate climate change, and again, we don't want to get into that could take hours, but it becomes paramount to do it, because Indigenous leadership and conservation is in that area. The climate action, IPCAs are climate action. So I think it's going to happen. It's happening, and we're in the middle of the event now. Just to quote some wise words I've heard recently, 10,000 years of good weather are over, and so yeah, no, I think that's exactly why IPCAs probably in many ways for a lot of people are a priority and seen as a significant and important way forward. So I think it's one and the same. It's just I just may not quite understand the use of the word matched. I apologize.
Thanks very much. I'm actually going to jump in and just say a couple of concluding remarks before I turn it over to Elder Marilyn for her closing remarks and a closing prayer. I wanted to, on behalf of the David Suzuki Foundation, Birds Canada, and Ontario Nature, thank you so much, Wesley, for taking the time, and thank all of the participants. And I think it's very clear from the conversation and from Wesley's answers that there's a strong recognition that Indigenous stewardship and conservation is thousands of years old and ongoing, but the landscape of recognition and the landscape of securement, especially securement against industrial activities, those are emergent fields, and they're fields that the federal government is exploring, and I think that in many instances we have to push provinces more to explore. And our three groups are also exploring. And to that end, I wanted to mention that this is the first of a number of webinars that we plan to host. As many of you are aware, we were planning to host a workshop in Thunder Bay that we had to cancel because of the COVID-19 crisis. But we do have upcoming 2 more workshops, one that looks at the policy landscape of Ontario with some insight from the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA. So we'll be hosting a workshop on that, and one that looks at the potential market benefits of land protection and carbon sequestration. So if you're not on our email list, then you can send a message to Jackie through the chat function, and we will also be sending out some slides or some notes post this conversation. So thank you all very much for joining, and with that, I will turn it over to Elder Marilyn for her closing remarks and closing prayer.
I've really enjoyed listening to everybody, and I'm just going to give just a brief overview about what I'm hearing. You talk about conservation areas. Maybe we need to start thinking about conservation earth, water, and sky world. When we talk about this word co-management, and everybody is upscale, downscale, we look for a different meaning of it. And in Anishinaabe thinking, we are in co-management. And how that is to be is that we receive the markings of a turtle with all the full instructions in the forever of how we are supposed to take care of the land as Creator's helper. So yes, we are in co-management under Creator's law. It's a very powerful day out here. We have snowstorms. We had a couple inches of snow. I think they call that water effect or bay effect, Great Lakes effect snow, but we do have it. And it was just absolutely beautiful to see that grandmother covered her children one more time with her beautiful shawl. It's part of that healing. And last night I had the opportunity to go and visit and sing and speak to Wawas Koni Jesus, the May moon. And it's what we call the Nokomis Jesus right now, and understand the relationship of what it is that we are to do and be grateful for in the May moon, the flowers. It's grandmother showing off her children. It's a reminder of all the new life that's to come. So in all this panic of pandemic and everything, we can get ourselves spiritually sick. But the earth keeps working. The sky world keeps working. The stars don't move. They're still there with all the leadership for us to have governance of. In our territory, we do have Indigenous protected area as a beginning. And for me, being an older person, I wish this had happened 30 years ago, because in the 30 years, the number of elders and the knowledge keepers of transference of knowledge would have been greater than what it is today. However, I'm grateful to have been asked in our territory to speak about this, to leave it on a recording for the next generation. I feel that our people are going in a very positive way, and it's understanding both worlds in terms of the scientific and strongly the cultural. I can hardly wait till we can go and visit over in those islands. I can hardly wait to show the young people what they need to know in the plants and where things spawn and what you need to take care of, making sure that people don't encroach buildings on those very special areas. So what I'm trying to say is that if we don't look for ownership, but rather responsibilityship, if there's such a new word, you know, we can do this, and we have done it, and that's great. It's allowing us all to have a moment to hear and listen and share with each other, and that's quite a gift. So listening, sometimes you wonder why things transpire the way that they do. So for me, it was to listen to what people had to say. So I'm going to share a few words about what Grandmother Nokomis would want us to hear and listen to. Zawem Nishing Nongo Skak Jimeno Namagandan Windamam and Jimeno Wabamang Nietzsche on a Schnabe Jimeno Nung Dong De Wa Nishnabe Jimeno Ganoko Nishnabe Jimeno Wege Niji Nishnabe Aha Miigwich Jeminado. What those words are asking us and reminding us is blessing all the good things in a day, and to only carry good thoughts, to see good things in people in the universe, and to listen to all things and from each other, and talk in a good way to Earth Woman, water, the sky world, and to each other. And it will help us walk with each other in a very good way. And thank the Great Spirit for allowing us to share this few moments in time. So with that, I ask you to have a very good day. I'm checking everybody's hairdo just to see if any of you are cheating. Anyway, you look like the rest of us, all fuzzy. Anyway, and that's something that we need to think about as well. You know, not panic. We got caught up in some very serious things of manifested. If I had to go somewhere right now, my fingernails just wouldn't quite make it, because I've been working out on the island, playing in the dirt and raking and doing all those good things before the black flies come. But even those little flyers, they do such a huge job. They're the ones that pollinate the blueberries, the wee tiny things. So it's a double purpose for them. So if you got to feed them with water from your veins, good blood, then so be it, because they will feed us too. Anyway, miigwech, oh, miigwech.
Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us, and stay safe, and we'll be in touch.